Thanks for tuning into Season 3 of the Forward Podcast, a resource brought to you by MeadowBrook Church. In this season, we're exploring the topic of missional living and how we live with an eternal focus in our community and around the world. I'm Daniel Doak, your host for this season, and I'm joined by Mike Nemi, the missions pastor here at MeadowBrook Church. In today's episode, we're talking about short-term trips and who should engage and how you go about engaging on those trips. So, Mike, I think back to, we've talked about just a brief overview early on in the season about missions. We built that foundation of like biblically why missions is important for us to engage. You know, we talked about the Great Commission, but this episode specifically is about short-term trips. Yeah. So define that for us. Help us understand what meets the criteria of being a short-term trip.
Yeah, when we're talking short-term trips, we're talking about from our local church, MeadowBrook Church, how we engage for the sake of the Great Commission and the gospel going forward, disciples being made, churches planted, with our partners who are located all around the world, right? And we do that in a short amount of time. So we're talking typically 8 to 14 day windows, right? Many of our trips try to fall within the 8 day from like a Friday to Saturday or Sunday kind of window. So that when we're asking people to go on some of these trips, they only have to take a week, you know, and they can save the rest of their vacation time with their family or things like that. So we don't want to eat up all their vacation on a trip most of the time.
And if you don't go to MeadowBrook, you're listening to this from another church. Like most churches I know, their trips are the same time frame. It's, you know, 14, 10-day trips, sometimes a little less. Yeah. So that's generally the window I've seen for most churches that engage in short-term mission.
Yes, that's right.
So, like I said, we talked about the Great Commission and how it says to go to Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Yeah. So, based on that, though, who shouldn't be considering going to the ends of the earth?
Yeah. My first thought is older folks. There's a lot of able-bodied, strong older folks, right? And I love them, and if they're able, great. But, you know, there are certain folks medically that just cannot physically endure a plane trip, right? Or a variety of reasons like that. So those folks right off the bat, hey, you know, maybe the Lord doesn't have you getting on a plane, you know, but that doesn't mean he doesn't want you involved. You know, you can pray, you can help send and fund people to go to the nations and be active in the engagement. We talked about that in an earlier episode. Sometimes it's just a season in life, right? I'm the missions pastor around here. I've got a wife and 3 kids, and for years, my wife, who also was a missionary 20-something years ago, she's been overseas, been on numerous short-term trips and living over there, wants to get back to the field at some point, but she felt for this season in our lives, she needed to be home. Yeah. I would go overseas, and we weren't ever going to go together when our kids were still small and in the house and not able to take care of themselves. So that day is coming in the few years where she and I will be able to travel together, and I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
So we've eliminated, obviously, if you have health or reason like that automatically disqualifies you from engaging on going. You can, like you said, still send, still be a part of international global missions. But outside that, like, missions should be considered, these short-term trips should be considered by everybody. And like you said, there's seasons in life. But at some point, those seasons are going to end. And so there's a measure of, hey, am I actually looking for opportunities to be engaging in those trips now, or preparing for when this season is ending and I can go to actually be a part of this trip? And so the thing that's really what this episode is about is let's walk through that. Let's make sure this is a realistic understanding that people can engage. It's not a huge outside the ballpark of reality for people, and realize it is obtainable for you to go.
Yeah. And first off, so let's flip it back. Who do we want to go on these things? Well, let's start with the very foundation. You've got to be a believer. You've got to be a follower of Christ, a disciple who has placed your faith in Jesus for your salvation, who is seeking to faithfully live out your faith in your daily context, in your family life, your work life, your church life, every other area of your life. That's who we want to consider to go on these trips, because you're going to be engaging, doing gospel work. So we want gospel lives to be doing gospel work.
Yeah, that's great. So obviously the foundation of that, be a believer.
Yeah.
And then there's some logistical things that just have to take place for you to get on a plane and go to a different country and serve.
Passport's the first thing on the list. And I've told people a lot over the years, you can't say yes to me unless you have a passport. Yep. So you can't even consider getting on a plane to leave this country without a passport. So that's step one. So for those who are listening and you're like, I don't know how to do this, well, you can go online and do the whole application, or you can just go downtown to the post office. There, right there, as you're looking at the post office, at the front counter at the post office, to the right is a glass door that says passport office. And you walk right in there, ask them, they'll give you an application, walk you every step of what you need to do. And you take it home, fill it out, get the picture, come back, and they mail it off. And then bada bing, bada boom, you'll get the passport.
And that's something, if you are in a season where you're not able to engage, there are steps you can be taking right now to say, hey, when the Lord leads, because you never know when that's going to happen. It may surprise you, and a lot of times it does. You have everything in place to say, hey, if God calls you to say, hey, in 3 months, there's a trip open, I need you to be on that trip. You have everything in place to say, okay, I'll go.
And a passport's not necessarily a cheap thing. It's about $135, $140, but it's good for 10 years. So for $13 a year, you can go anywhere in the world.
And a plane ticket.
And a plane ticket. That's right.
So another layer of that, and some of the trips we go on, especially to Uganda and other places in South America, there's some extra steps we have to take just to ensure medically we're safe.
Yes. Yeah. We're talking about shots and vaccines. So typically when we're looking at our different locations and partners around the world, we're going to try to follow the CDC guidelines. And so we will tell all the team members, hey, look, up to date on your typical shots, or these are the ones that the CDC says, hey, they're recommended, not required. But for Uganda specifically, I think that's the only location we have one that's actually required. And it's not a cheap one. But the good thing is that yellow fever vaccine is good for life. So it's a one-time deal. But it's an investment for the rest of your life.
Another thing, a lot of these vaccines are not always easy to find. So as you think about, hey, I may not be a season to go now, or maybe the next year or so I'm looking at going, that's a great time to start saying, hey, I'm going to get my vaccines. I'm going to make sure I'm up to date on my hepatitis and tetanus, and I'm going to get all the shots that I need to be able to go on these trips. Because like you said, there's some cost involved in that. Oh, yeah. And so if you take time to plan ahead, that when the Lord moves, that trip opens up, you have all the essentials taken care of to be able to go.
And you don't really want to get all 10 shots at once.
No one wants that.
Spread them out. Been there, done that. Military folks and missionaries, we've all had those multiple pops a day. Yeah. But yeah, just talk to your doctor, your family doctor, and they can kind of help you walk through.
Okay, so just a few more things that we think through the logistics that have to take place before you travel. One is time. Yeah. So that is an essential thing that you have to have, along with the passport and vaccines. Yes. You can't just magically go on a trip unless you have the availability to go.
That's right. Because most of us, especially in our life stage, we have work commitments, right? We have jobs and places we are required to be so that we can live. And so you got to have vacation time to be able to take time away from your workplace. And so you have to have that banked up. And so that's what we're talking about when you got to have time available. For those who are retired, they have a little more freedom to do that. And they can kind of pick up and go, and as they're able-bodied, and some of them have a little more financial freedom, if I can talk, and which also helps. And that brings us to that other one. Money is another one. So a lot of times trips aren't cheap, right? I mean, you and I have both been on so many planes in our lives. They're not cheap. They're long. They're hard. But we don't want money to be a limiting factor for our folks, right? So we have a budgeted scholarship line item that is available to MeadowBrook members for these trips, for people to be able to participate in. One of the other things we've been able to do, and you've helped us out with this, is set up a link whereby, and I really like this because they can send a link to their family, their life group, and say, hey, I'm going on this trip. I'm going to go participate in a short-term trip. Will you pray for me? Would you consider helping fund that? Well, that gives those opportunities for the life group members, the church, to rally around them and be good senders, right? They're praying and helping them get there.
Yeah, I think it's important. I had something that someone said a long time ago, but it stuck with me, is that generally, most always, maybe not every time, but most always, service requires sacrifice. Yeah. So when you think about your time, vacation, it's probably going to take some sacrifices, some days you may be able to use to go to the lake or to the beach. Financially, you may have to say, hey, I'm going to step back. But at the same time, I've always seen that God provided resources for people that He's called and are willing to go. And I know with my wife, she works for a big corporation. Yeah. But there's been times that she's been able to use volunteer days that she just gets as part of her job to do things at church. It wasn't for a mission trip, but there's some opportunities a lot of times if you're willing to actually be bold and reach out and say, hey, if you're feeling like God's calling you, He's going to make a way. Be willing to engage others in that process and let them be a part. And even people that are not believers in the church, a lot of times, you'll see that God's moving in those situations to prepare you to be able to actually be on a mission trip.
Yeah, and I like the life group rallying around the mission team members aspect, because it brings that more communal aspect to the local church life, right? They were meant to do this together. They are more, as a life group, invested in the partnership at that point too, because they want to know what's going on, what happened on the trip, who'd you meet, what'd the Lord do when you come back, right? We've been praying for you. And now they hear the stories, they see the pictures, they know the names of the partners and people on the ground as well. Yeah. And so it just tightens that relationship between us and our global partners all the more as life groups get involved with team members going. Yeah,
and we mentioned earlier, like, hey, this is something that generally can be applied to people in different churches. And I don't know of a good Bible-believing church that if you say, I want to engage in a mission trip, can you financially help me? Whether you have a gigantic church or a small church or a huge mission program or no missions program, I don't know a church that's not going to help you in that process. Right. So you may be the leader stepping up to initiate that if you go to a church that doesn't have that program in place. But I think you'll find a lot of times, more often than not, people are a lot more eager to give and support than you would even begin to believe. Right. So the last thing is just an opportunity to go. Yeah. So we are, again, blessed. We have a missions pastor. We have a heart in our church that's focused on missions. Yeah. So specifically in the context of MeadowBrook, we have several global partners we work with, and we just have a few more minutes left, but just briefly, just help us to understand just how we can reach out and be a part of these trips here at MeadowBrook.
So the Lord has kind of spread us out over the years since I've been here. And it wasn't always me looking for partners. A lot of times, a lot of these partnerships that we have now in Central America, South America, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, East Asia. So we're kind of spread out across the globe in a lot of different cultural contexts, religious worldviews, and things like that. Some are in more rural areas. Others are up in very urban, modern cities. We've got a couple who are in Tokyo, Japan, who are actually local here, but we came by them because somebody I knew from a different church here in town said, hey, we're sending this couple and they need funding. Would MeadowBrook consider? So we got to know them. And our team said, yeah, we think this is really a neat idea. And it puts us in connection, praying and partnering for the sake of the gospel in Tokyo, Japan, which I don't know if you know this, but it is the largest metro area in the world. 37 million people in the metro area. There's 5 million people in Alabama. And there's a city with 37 million with 99% unreached people. So there's great need of the gospel. And they are back in the States right now doing some extra funding and stuff because they've had a kid this past year. But when they go back, they're musically inclined. So they're going to be working with the Japanese church to develop Japanese worship music, which I think is fascinating. Because right now you had all these Western missionaries come in, plant churches in Japan ever since World War II. But they've been singing our songs and our hymns. And when you translate, you have the same music, but when you translate the words, it's not a one-to-one correlation between Japanese and English. And so some of the theology gets a little wonky or lost in translation. And so they're going to work with the Japanese church to develop a Japanese heart worship music, which I think is just amazing work. So that they sing their songs. And we get to be a part of that by supporting them and partnering with them and hopefully, Lord willing, going to visit them. Argentina, we have a great church partner down there that was an IMB connection. And they have planted a church outside of the city that we have helped with over the years. I had the great privilege of being asked to send a video because one of the guys that grew up and was equipped and was being ordained in the home church, Laniers, he's been called to be the pastor of this church plant. And so I got to send a video for his ordination service several years ago. And so this year they're actually moving from church plant status to autonomous local church status. And so part of the conversation when I go back down later this year is, okay, so where are we going next? You know, where are we going to plant from either this church plant or from the home church? Where are we going next in ministry in the BA region? And so it's going to be awesome to be part of that. Costa Rica, we've had a long time relationship with Jose and Gabby Prado, who do Hope Ministries down there from a crisis pregnancy ministry like we have here in town. He's done sports ministry. They've got Nicaraguan refugees that they've done with. He's planted a church out of Hope Ministries that we've been able to partner with. We've got another new couple going to the Czech Republic, of all places, Eastern Europe. And this was another friend of a friend called us up and said, hey, would you consider these guys? And they're going to go work with the Czech Republic, with the church in the Czech, and help strengthen the church, because they've not had a whole lot of leadership and theological training for the pastors and the church in general. Yeah. And so they're going to go help strengthen the church in that way and also be able to do ministry inside Ukraine as well. Yeah. And we get to be part of that good frontline gospel work, which is really cool. South Sudan, Uganda, Africa, long-time partnership, right? We started doing community development work through what we call the CHE program, Community Health Evangelism. They had a civil war in South Sudan, and our whole village and about 1 million refugees fled out of South Sudan over a decade ago into Uganda, into refugee camps. And so for the last 10 years or so, we've been doing church planter training with a couple of our key guys, Juma and Moses, who help us identify potential church planters, pastor types, and we'll put them through a 3-year cycle of training and then release them. So they've gone back into Uganda, some back into South Sudan, and planted over 100 churches in the 10-plus years we've been doing this. We've got other work there in Uganda at this Christian school where there's 700-plus students, mostly from Uganda, but also South Sudan and some of the neighboring countries in Africa, where we have an opportunity a couple times a year to go down and teach from God's Word and disciple these students. And so one of the former students is now the chaplain of this school, and it's a pleasure to be able to, we've known him since he was a student there, and to work side by side with him. In the Middle East, we have 2 partners. We've got one who's a doctor and another who's a local church partner right there, a couple of the pastors on staff there. And, man, they need encouragement being where they're at, right? And I think, you look at the New Testament and you see Paul writing these letters that are just, hey, I know this church. I've spent so much time with you, and just let me encourage you. Let me help encourage you, help strengthen you so that you guys live out the gospel well where you're at, and it's reciprocated from them to us. And so that church in the Middle East, it seems to be like that. They're doing good gospel work where they're located, but they're in a hard area, and they need to know that other people are in it with them, that are praying for them, because sometimes the government's not that friendly. Sometimes the culture is not that friendly in there. That's
great. I think the beauty in all we've talked about is we have a lot of different options. We're not asking everybody to go live in a grass hut in Uganda. There's very developed places that we work. And so there's a little bit of a place for everybody in ministry.
Yeah, it really is. And just one more point before we wrap up. But, I like the idea of how the Lord has put those partners because, we've got rural and we've got urban settings. We've got poor all the way to middle class and wealthy. So it encompasses the whole economic spectrum and worldview and religious spectrum, right? We're in Far East where you got Buddhism, Shintoism. You've got the Middle East where you got Islam. You've got Catholics in Latin America. You got secular thinking in Europe. And tribal stuff in Africa as well. And so we've got a host of worldviews. So this tells me the gospel is for all these different worldviews. It's for all the poor all the way to the wealthy. The gospel is for every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so it's for everybody.
That's great. Thanks again as we talk through this episode. It's so exciting to hear how God is providing opportunities. And I would encourage you too. We've been saying, if you have questions, reach out to us. This time specifically, if you're at a church and you're just curious about how to engage in missions, I'm going to give Mike's email address. It's mike@mbchurch.com. There are plenty of people you can reach out to, but I know Mike will be willing to. And specifically for our MeadowBrook family, hey, look for these opportunities. Engage in conversations with the people that have been. Be a part of what God is doing in the kingdom ministry. We look forward to next week's episode when we talk about going on long-term to the mission field. Don't tune this out, because you all have a part to play in that, just as we've talked about throughout the season.
Come back and listen.
Thanks again for tuning into this season of the Forward Podcast and this episode about going on short-term mission trips. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Forward Podcast.